Dearest Queers, happy Monday morning, happy new moon in Cancer. I'm coming to you early this morning because I have a morning meeting. I wanted to make sure that I hit you all up before then instead of later, since I was a little late last week. So here you have me in this very unique experience of me talking to other humans, or at least a screen, before 9 a.m. So glad to be here with you all. I'm Doolin. I'm a healer and mentor, and I work with queer and trans folks struggling with feelings of disconnection and loneliness. Talking about strategies for connection and how they can live their best relational lives. I bring a trauma-informed lens with a spiritual slant, and I'm happy to be here. So this is the 5th episode of Dearest Queers. They're just like adding up. I can't believe we're 5 weeks in already with this series. The live series came from survey results that I collected from you all back in May, where you sent in some amazing questions, and so I'm answering those via this live series. And today's question, which I'm very excited about because I get to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is boundaries. The question is, how can I experience strong emotions and still stay open to others feeling differently? So to the asker of this question, I see you and I love you, and this is a really good question. It can be really hard to feel consistently connected to people if when we are in relationship with others, we're always feeling a lot of like really big feelings or feeling reactive or triggered. And I also just want to like reassure all of us that that's what it means to be human and to be in relationship with one another. Like this is the practice of sort of sussing out what belongs to us and what belongs to other people. And so today we're going to talk about boundaries, which I love a lot. And I want to talk specifically about something called the listening boundary. And learning about this boundary changed my life. I didn't have the language for this thing that I knew was a big problem for me. And so learning, like I just understood it as like about my way of relating, or this lack of boundary as like a result of trauma and a damaged sense of self. And I don't know about you, but like having like positive terminology or understanding of a concept and being able to like understand it in the tangible is like a really helpful perceptual shift, instead of just like walking around believing that like we are damaged because of our trauma and like a damaged sense of self. So that's why I want to bring the knowledge of the listening boundary to you all today, because it was really transformative for me in my work around boundaries and developing a stronger sense of self. So the listening boundary, so I learned it from therapist Vicki Tidwell Palmer, who I reference a lot, like 8 million times. I've referenced her podcast, which is called Beyond Bitchy, which is about boundaries, just because her work and her podcast were so impactful for me. And so she calls the listening boundary the most complex and also the mother of all boundaries, which is a big statement. We're processing the... Okay, I think I'm back. I was talking about the listening boundary. So it's how we take in, filter, and respond to information that's coming in. And just remembering that we're filtering information all of the time. All of the time. We're like being bombarded with information, especially now that we're like less in person with people and we've got these like screens and texts and like, so all this information. So we can perceive information in 3 ways. So that includes that something is true for me, something is not true for me, or neither. So we either need more information to decide whether it's true for us or not, or else it's something that's kind of irrelevant to us, like it doesn't really matter. So true for me, not true for me, or it's like irrelevant. Where this gets really tricky is that for those of us who've experienced a lot of trauma, like especially relational trauma, so like histories of like being gaslit or other emotional abuse, you know, having a queer trans identity in a world where either our families have told us that we like don't exist, or we've been erased or invisibilized, our listening boundary is deeply impacted by that trauma and those wounds and the stories that we filter the world, that like we process information through. And so let me give you an example from my personal life, because at the beginning of this episode, I told you how important learning about the listening boundary was for me. So the way that this would show up for me often is that like something would happen in one of my relationships, like something that felt hurtful or harmful. And so I would like have all my feelings about it and like sit with it and process it and like work to like bring it up to the person that I was in relationship with. You know, I would have the conversation. I would say, this is blah, blah, blah. I'd like use all my I statements. And then let's say that person like would get defensive or would invalidate me or would say, that's not true. Here's my perception and what actually happened. And because my listening boundary was so horrendous, I would automatically toss my experience out the window. They would share their perception and their experience with me, and I would just adopt that as my own. And so if, we can perceive information as true for me, not true for me, or neither, like someone would share their perception and experience with me, and that would suddenly become true for me. And so this was like a deep sense of self-betrayal, because my listening boundary and my own sort of like relational trauma and wounds, like my sense of self and my self-regard was just terrible. Because I didn't grow up in an environment that celebrated and validated and encouraged me, so I learned to survive by abandoning myself. And like that practice was so harmful. But learning the term listening boundary and understand, like beginning to see that this is what I was doing, like regularly, like in like large like sort of large as, like an intimate relationship, but also like things with like my supervisors at work or with other people. Like I was just like watching how quickly, like even though I was pretty sure that like this was my experience and perception, how quickly I was to like set that aside to take someone else's experience on as like the truth, as like the truth of the situation. So now that I had the awareness and that's how I was relating to myself, the work was beginning to strengthen that listening boundary because it was so porous. It wasn't filtering really. I mean, it was filtering, but like it had this like tone to it. And so, the themes running through these Dearest Queers, like each episode has been about developing a relationship with self, and that remains like absolutely relevant in this case as well. So if I don't know what my perception and experience is, how can I know whether or not someone else's is true for me? Like, if I don't even have a baseline to say, this is my perception and this is my experience, how can I even, like, take in another's experience to, like, tease them apart about, like, what belongs to whom, So I began to fortify my filter, and that looked like really slowing down the process, like, when I was greeted with another person's perception or experience, like sitting with that. So slowing down the process, whether it was conflict or like a important conversation with someone else, like what was true for me, like based on their experience, or was any of what they were saying, like was that true or was it not true for me? And what was my truth in the midst of all of that? So that takes a like very diligent practice and really sitting with myself and really being able to tease out again, like what is my perception and experience, and then like how does that I don't know, for some reason I cannot think of the word, like, what's mine, what's theirs, and, like, are there places where there, like, the Venn diagram overlaps or not? So it feels really important in this moment for me to throw in the definition of intimacy. And so intimacy is being present with the experience of another human. And understanding that the highest purpose of listening to someone else is to know and understand someone. Not to, like, tell them all the ways that they're wrong or all the ways that we are right. Like, that's not what intimacy is. It's being present with someone else's experience, even if it's different than ours, even if it's triggering to us or reactive. I'm not saying that it's easy. It is, like, a deep relational and spiritual practice to be able to do that. But if you don't know what your experiences and perceptions are and how they differ from other people's, like, if you don't know where you end and where others begin, like, you cannot experience true intimacy. I'm going to say that again because it feels really important. So, like, if you don't know or have awareness of your own perception and experience and how that differs from other people's, you can't experience true intimacy with someone. You can't be present with someone else's experience if it's getting all entangled in what's yours then and what is theirs. So I knew that my work on the listening boundary was beginning to pay off when, like, I was okay with the fact that, like, someone that I cared about or that I was in relationship with, when it was okay with me that we had a different perception about, like, a similar shared experience. Like, a different perception or, like, conflict to say, this is my experience, this is how I was impacted, and they could hear me and say, okay, this is what happened for me, and that we could, like, both exist with different experiences and still, like, show up for one another in relationship. And I was like, this is a sign of health. Like, this is a sign of, like, healthy relationship. And that, like, I don't feel overwhelmed or threatened by the fact that they have a different experience or that, like, that inevitably makes me wrong. You know, so really beginning to, like, shift or rewrite that story and, like I said, fortify or strengthen that listening boundary. So I'm not saying that, like, in those moments it doesn't trigger old stories or feelings of, like, being young for me. you know, but that's like when when the self-talk then comes in about like, it's safe to be my own person, it's safe to like have my own experience, and that like remembering that everyone like has a right to their own perception, and that includes you. So like we all get to have our own perception of the world, of experiences. Like that's what it means to be sovereign beings, is that like we are existing within our own sovereignty in terms of perception and experience. And trying to defend ourselves or convince another person like of our reality or like of our perception is just a waste of time and energy. Like, especially if they've already made up their mind. Like, I'm not talking about, like, if you all are in, like, a conversation about, like, please, I want to, like, listen to you and understand your experience, like, then, like, yes, you're being invited. But if someone is sort of closed off or just you're not being invited into that conversation, it's fruitless and a waste of your resources to be trying to convince someone of that. So, you know, and I, like, part of my own spiritual practice and work is, like, being aware and catching myself sometimes, like, when I'm, like, really feeling this, like, need to be right or to be seen, about, like, that my way is the right way, and it's, like, a really good practice to be like, okay, like, this is my experience and my truth and, like, my boundary, or, like, whatever I choose to do in this situation, and that's theirs. It's okay if ours are different. So, like, I'm not going to back down from my truth, meaning, like, I'm going to stand strong, and this is what I believe, and this is what I'm going to continue to, like, stand in. But, like, really watching how, like, entangled I feel the need to get in someone else's perception and to, like, switch that and, like, really need them to see my experience as the capital T truth. And so, to wrap this up, the way you can experience strong emotions and still stay open to others feeling different, dear asker, is to cultivate a practice of honoring your own experience, first and foremost, and continue to develop your listening boundary. So the more we allow room for our own experience, the more we can be present with the experiences of others, which is true intimacy, even if they're different than ours, even if we have big feelings about them. Like I said, this is like a deep relational and spiritual practice. Being very clear about what belongs to us and what belongs to others will help us in this practice. And if you'd like a little extra help with that process, I'd love for you to reach out, to connect around this. As I love talking about boundaries because they've been so transformative for me, have really given me the framework to begin to build a sturdy foundation. So that's it for this week. I really hope you enjoyed learning about the listening boundary. It's not one that like I hear talked about ever, and it's like I said, a much easier, something tangible instead of just being like, oh, you struggle with codependency, or like you're enmeshed. Like, great. Like, what am I supposed to do with that? You know, other than like, again, feel sort of like damaged or in my trauma about that. Like, can you help me like really break this down? And that's why something tangible and concrete like the listening boundary and understanding what it meant to work on that was so helpful for me in this practice. So, I will see you next Monday. If you have a question about all things related to loneliness or disconnection or connection, please feel free to send it over via DM. I'd love if you shared this video with someone who you think would benefit from learning about the listening boundary. And you can follow me on Instagram @GrayDoolin. All of these videos I'm also posting on my YouTube channel, which is just Gray Doolin as well. And so you can find them there for additional replays or for sharing. I love you all so much. You're doing fantastic work. And I will see you next week.